Okay, here we go. So, Turn the Screw, Chapter 2. Here's some lecture notes. To continue with the governess's strange declaration at the end of Chapter 1, and the idea of her apprehension and her suspicion, we begin Chapter 2 first by talking about the little gentleman, and how there's something that is going to drive that suspicion further. This quote right here, the first day it had been, on the whole, as I've expressed, reassuring, but I was to see it wind up in keen apprehension. That ambiguity, the dueling emotions, comes out right there. She receives the letter. Kind of odd. It's first an initial letter from the gentleman, who says, "This I recognize is from the headmaster, and the headmaster's an awful bore. Read him, please, deal with him, but mind you don't report, not a word, I'm off." Very short, curt, goes into the gentleman's idea of not wanting to be involved. Somewhat frustrating, probably, that he is so hands-off and doesn't even look at the letter that came to him. She doesn't want to open it, but eventually she does. She's full of distress, finally decides to open up to Miss Gross. And she goes down to talk to Miss Gross and basically says the child's dismissed from school. Miss Gross says, "It gave me a look that I remarked at the moment, then visibly with a quick blankness seemed to try to take it back." The governess seems to almost assume that Miss Gross knows more than she's letting on, and this is an idea that she continues throughout the chapter, that she knows more, she's not letting everything out, she's not expressing everything, and the governess seems to be trying to figure out what that is. At the same time, Miss Gross seems to be fairly honest, but we want to understand that the governess is reading into things, and that reading into things we need to be very skeptical about. We need to take with a grain of salt. We need to not assume that she is right necessarily. Okay. A little further down, she gives her the letter to read. Of course, Miss Gross says, "My counselor couldn't read. I went to my mistake, which I attenuated as I could, and opened my letter again to repeat it to her. Then, faltering the act and folding it up once more, I put it back in my pocket." Basically, the letter is never read. We never know exactly what the letter says. We never understand what is contained in that letter. There's no recording of it. Barely do we get a summary of it from the governess towards Miss Gross. I think that's pretty exceptional and something that we should definitely understand and look at. As Miss Gross asks about the letter, the governess says they go into no particulars. They simply express their regret that it should be impossible to keep him. We know that the governess assumes this means that he will injure others or injure himself, and they do not want him there for that reason. If we find out any more information, it's going to have to come from Miles. Okay. As far as Miss Gross's response, she cannot believe that Miles would ever hurt somebody, which is what the governess suggests. We don't know exactly if the dean of the school said that in the letter. But there is such a flood of good faith in it that, though I had not yet seen the child, my very fears made me jump to the absurdity of the idea. So she backtracks from her idea that this is a bad child and instead thinks, "Oh, Miss Gross says he's good, he must be good." We find out Miles is only 10 years old. Miss Gross cannot believe that he would do any of that. We have a strange moment where Miles is compared to Flora. Here we see the governess looking at her. "I turned and saw that Flora, whom 10 minutes before I had established in the classroom with a sheet of white paper, a pencil, and a copy of nice round O's, now presented herself to view at the open door." So here she's kind of jumped up and walked over to listen to what her governess and Miss Gross were speaking about. She expressed in her little way an extraordinary detachment from disagreeable duties. Looked at me, however, with a great childish light that seemed to offer it as a mere result of the affection she had conceived for my person. So she seems able to do disagreeable duties, which I assume is the writing of letters. And the governess sees Flora as just wanting to follow her around, and that she has great affection for the governess. At which point the governess, in a minute, covers her with kisses, with a sob of atonement. And I think we need to think about the fact that this has been a day that they've known each other. And I know that she's a little girl, and she's very cute, and she's very sweet, and they've become somewhat attached to each other. But I would like to think that most people, especially in a prim and proper Victorian society, would not, a day after meeting a child, wrap their arms around them, hug them desperately, and cover them with kisses. Once again, I'm a little skeptical of this governess. Okay. A little later, her own suspicion kind of comes out again as she talks about Miss Gross. She feels like I began to fancy she rather sought to avoid me. She feels like Miss Gross once again is hiding something. She asks her, I assume that you've never known Miles to be bad. At which point she says, oh, never known him, I don't pretend that. The governess is upset again. Once again, up and down, back and forth, back and forth. She says, yes, I have known him to be bad. Thank God, bad kids are the way it's supposed to be. Kind of funny, kind of random, but definitely the idea that a boy should be a boy, and it doesn't mean that they are prim and proper all the time, which I can appreciate, and I think we can all appreciate a little bit. And she says, you like them with the spirit to be naughty. Keeping pace with her answer, she says, so do I. So the governess says, I do. They discuss the idea of Miles contaminating or corrupting others. Now remember, this idea of corruption has already come about when we talked about the gentleman and the gentleman seducing or having this seduction element as he meets with the governess originally. So that's going to come up, and it's going to come up as we go and meet Peter Quint and Miss Jessel here in a little bit. They have the joke, are you afraid he'll corrupt you? Take that with a grain of salt. Remember that things that we might say ironically may later tend to be more real than we took them to be. Okay. They talk about the last governess, mainly to try to get some more information about Miles. But interesting things pop up, such as Miss Gross says, oh, she was also young and pretty, almost as young and almost as pretty, miss, even as you. The governess says he seems to like us young and pretty, implying the gentleman. And then Miss Gross says, oh, he did. It was the way he liked everyone. And then, according to the governess's description of this, she looks at this as her giving away too much. She meant to say something different. She gets this inkling that, oh, Miss Gross is trying to talk about somebody else. This is a hidden piece of information. But Miss Gross says, I mean, that's his way, the master's. The governess says, well, who were you talking about first? Of whom did you speak first? And Miss Gross looks blank, but colors. So right away, the governess is seeing some ambiguity here, right? She looks blank, but she colors. Is she trying to hide something? Is that why she's reddening? She says, why, of course, of him, of the master. They go about this. The governess doesn't really read too much into it. So she tries to forget the idea that she thought Miss Gross had said more than she meant. However, we need to question, and the ambiguity is, did she really say more than she was supposed to? Is she really talking about Peter Quint? That is the question. Or is this just the governess having her own tainted perspective on this experience? Okay. As they talk about Miss Jessel, the governess asks, was she careful, particular? Miss Gross, once again, seems to be holding something back, says, about some things, yes. The governess wants more information, but Miss Gross considers, thinks about it, and it says, I'm not going to really talk about this. They talk about how she died, and Miss Gross just says, she went off. At which point the governess doesn't like that answer. She says, I don't know what there was in this brevity of Miss Gross's that struck me as ambiguous. She wants to know, went off to die? She was taken ill, you mean, and went home? And Miss Gross responds and says, I don't really know. She wasn't ill when she left. We had a nursemaid that was here who took care of the girl for a little bit and took the children during the period. But our young lady, Miss Jessel, never came back, and at the very moment I was expecting her, I heard from the master that she was dead. So the question becomes, is the master involved in any of this? What is the extent of this? It's a little questionable. Okay. The governess wants to know what he died of, which Miss Jessel died of. Miss Gross says, the master never told me, but please, miss, I must get back to my work. Which we should read as, we should see it in an ambiguous way. Is it that literally the governess is grilling her, interrogating her, and asking her too many questions, and Miss Gross really just doesn't want to talk to her? The governess has told us that Miss Gross immediately liked her. Who told us that? The governess. We don't know if Miss Gross really likes the governess. We don't know Miss Gross's perspective. We just know what the governess says about her. And everything, remember, might be somewhat jaded because it's coming from this unreliable narrator's perspective. We don't know about the governess, and there are going to be more things that come about that make us question the governess's authenticity and genuineness in what she says. Is she trying to hold things back? Remember, this is a Gothic tale. Is there some kind of mental deformity in the governess? We already know that she had some kind of relationship with Douglas, was 10 years older. May not have escalated to anything physical, but clearly Douglas was taken with her, the same way this governess was taken with the gentleman, and it seems to be a hand-on-hand corruption of youth, in my opinion. But it's ambiguous. We don't know. Maybe we should take this story just as it is. Maybe everything the governess says is true, and we should just read into it as she does. But the ambiguity is there, is what Henry James is trying to capture. Do we trust her? Do we not? It's up to us to make that decision. Okay. We will continue with the next chapter in just a bit.